enjoy it. Because if you enjoy it, the reader might well enjoy it. But if you don't enjoy writing it, I can promise you the reader won't enjoy reading it either.
You're listening to the Author Stories Podcast, bringing you the story behind the stories and the storytellers.
Margaret White,
Terry Brooks,
Sheena Kamal,
Matthew Quick,
J.T. Ellison,
Walt D. Williams,
Brad Ford,
Corey Doctorow,
Brandon Sanderson,
Robin Mott,
Ernest Klein, Jim Butcher,
Sherwin Harris.
Visit hankgarner.com for archives of all the shows. Today's guest is Bernard Cornwell. Hey everybody, thanks for tuning in to Author Stories. You know, we're quickly approaching 400 episodes. It blows my mind to look back and think about the shows that we've been able to do, and looking at the calendar at the shows that we have scheduled. Really phenomenal stuff coming up. It's amazing to me sometimes to think about the amount of people that we have not talked to yet on the show. And Dawn keeps scheduling excellent authors and from every genre just about every day. So thank you for tuning in and listening. And just because we're about to hit 400 episodes does not mean we're slowing down anytime soon. So be sure to go over to hankgarner.com and subscribe to the show. There's handy links in the sidebar where you can subscribe on your favorite podcast app, on your phone, on your computer, wherever you do it. You can find links there. You also find us on YouTube. There's a link in the sidebar as well. I'd like to thank some sponsors who faithfully support the show and allow us to do what we do. One of those is Scott Woodley from marlowemoss.net. Scott is an excellent editor, and authors, what you don't know can hurt you. A lot of times we think that you can just do a cursory read over and then hit that publish button. I can tell you from experience that even, having proofreaders and, going over it yourself, things still fall through the cracks no matter how attentive to details you are. That's why you need an editor who can come in and give you that other set of eyes and who understands the story process to help you make your story the best it can be. At marlowemoss.net, Scott will give you a free sample edit, and he can show you how he can help your story be the best it can be. You can go to marlowemoss.net today, and you can read some testimonials and see how he can help you turn your sentences into inspired sentences and polished paragraphs for print-worthy books. He has competitive rates and always delivers on time. He offers a full range of editorial and ghostwriting services to self-published and traditionally published authors. Turn your ideas into words and see your dreams become books. marlowemoss.net. Also, I'd like to thank Richard Thomas for sponsoring the show. Richard has an online fiction writers course, the University of Richard. And there's a link in the show notes. There's a banner there where you can click on and you can see the course guide. Lots and lots of classes coming up. He can help teach you to be the best writer you can be. There's classes coming up for the 2018 and 2019 season, like short story mechanics, writing flash fiction, contemporary dark fiction, advanced creative writing workshops, how to write a novel in a year, lots and lots of stuff from a very prolific and excellent writer, Richard Thomas, teaching you how to be the best writer you can be. It's the University of Richard. There's a link in the show notes. I'd also like to tell you about a new sponsor, George Kramer, and his new book, Blind to Blood. Ben Bergstall had a unique job. He was a tissue procurement specialist. When someone died, he would surgically remove people's body parts for donation. He really enjoyed doing it. So much so, when an anonymous email asked him to consider recovering people's body parts on the side, he was more than happy to oblige. The trouble was Ben sought out live people to fulfill his clandestine clients' needs. Read all about Ben's exploits in this riveting book that delves into tissue procurement, Blind to Blood by George Kramer. Pick up your copy today on Amazon and find out why people are saying this is an intense page-turner, that they are also fascinated by digging into the mind of Ben and finding out how he works. If you would like to see a look into the darker side of humanity, pick up Blind to Blood, the riveting new page-turner by George Kramer. As always, stay tuned at the end of the show for an audiobook clip from our good friend Richard Gleaves, the Jason Crane series. By the way, Richard is going to be my guest on episode 400 coming up, and I have been reading the Jason Crane series book 4 before anybody else has, so I'm pretty excited about that. Excellent stuff coming up, and yeah, I think you're going to love it. Well, thanks for joining me again for the Author Stories podcast, where I bring you the story behind the stories and the storytellers. This morning, I'm very excited to have a special guest on the show with me. Bernard Cornwell joins me this week, and welcome to the show, sir.
Well, thank you, Hank.
And, sir, I always ask my guests a variation of the same question to start the show, and that is, what is your first memory of wanting to be a writer?
I haven't a clue. It's too long ago. I mean, it must be at least 50, 60 years ago. I mean, I think I always had an idea that I wanted, I mean, at least from a kid, that I had an idea that writing was better than working, and so it has proved. I don't know. It's just always been there, I think, honestly.
I get that same answer, or a variation of that same answer a lot. There seems to be this thing with writers that it's just always been there, ingrained in some way.
I suppose it's a love of stories. I mean, as a kid, I loved fiction, and I think I just decided at some point that I wanted to write. Although I don't think I ever thought I would. I mean, does that make sense?
Sure.
I mean, eventually, you grow up and you go and you get a proper job, and it was a pure accident that drove me to actually indulge this rather ridiculous ambition to be a novelist.
I think that's very common, that storytellers understand that there's this thing ingrained in us. We want to tell stories, but there seems to be a disconnect between this thing that I love to do. Surely I can't actually provide for my family with that thing. That's
well, yeah, I mean, it's a very daunting prospect. I mean, not just providing for your family, although that's awfully nice if you can do that. But I mean, for somebody who wants to write a novel and has never written a novel, just the thought of putting 120, 140,000 words on paper is ghastly. And I can remember when I began thinking, God, I'll never ever do this. This is just ridiculous. And I've done it 55 times now, so I guess I was wrong.
What was the first book that you were able to complete and you said, I think this might be actually something?
Well, I don't know if I ever thought it might be something. The first book was one of the Sharp books. It was called Sharp's Eagle. And, I mean, to be really honest, I was desperate. I used to have a sort of proper job. I was editor of a television news program in London. But I just met an American and disastrously fell in love with her, completely, hopelessly, utterly in love with her. And Judy couldn't live in Britain for all sorts of very good reasons, mostly family reasons, and I didn't have ties to Britain. So I said, okay, I'll move to the States. And then the American government, in its wisdom, refused to give me a green card, and so I couldn't get a job. So I said, okay, I've always wanted to write a book, so that's what I'll do. And, well, that was 30-something years ago. We're still married. And it's a crazy thing to do, to just say, I'm going to write a book. But I did.
Oh, the ways that love has shaped our fates.
I know, yes, I know.
So where did the idea for the Sharp, that first Sharp?
Well, it came from Hornblower. I mean, it's shameless, really. It's a sort of copy of Hornblower. I used to love the Hornblower books as a kid, and he wrote 11 of them. And then some point when I was thinking, when I was working in television, still had this ambition to be a writer. By that time, there was Alexander Pope, Douglas Riemann, and I don't think Patrick O'Brien had started writing then. But they were all writing sort of Hornblower stories about naval officers who were sort of beating up Napoleon's navy. And I thought it's very odd that nobody's done the same thing for the army. And so I decided that's what I would do. if I ever did sit down and write a novel. So in a sense, it was a gap on the shelf, that there were plenty of historical novelists making money out of the Royal Navy, but none at all writing about Wellington's army. And in fact, when I wrote the book, I sent it to an agent in London, and at that time I was living in New Jersey. And he wrote back and said, nobody wants to read about the army. And I still meet him at parties in London occasionally, and he groans.
That's funny. And it's interesting that you take this very familiar subject, very familiar time period. Like you said, everyone knows about this time period, and everyone knows about the Navy, but you found a new way to come into the story. Was that something that you were familiar with? And
yes, I was very, very familiar with it, gotcha. and I was enthusiastic about it. And it really was, as it turned out, it was a gap on the shelf. And I think, I'm making no bones about this. I am a commercial writer.
Sure.
I write, as you say, to keep my family. And if you do that, you've got to write what other people want to read. And you always begin by writing what you yourself want to read. And then you hope that enough other people want, share that desire. So yes, it was a gap on the shelf, and I'm sure there are other gaps on the shelf now. People who want to write have to find it.
Well,
the big problem that all publishers have. A book suddenly becomes a huge, huge success. Whether it's Game of Thrones or 50 Shades of Grey, and within 6 months, the publishers are absolutely swamped with manuscripts which are 49 Shades of Grey or
right.
Game of Scepters. They're just absolutely copying, and they're not nearly as good. It's difficult becoming a writer. You've got to know what to write. Somebody once said to me, writing is easy, writing well is a bit more difficult. Knowing what to write about is really hard.
Right. Coming up with that first idea before everyone else does is really daunting. But you've the Sharp series has been, I think you could say it's successful. You've got 20 books in the series, just about. I think
it's 21. I think.
Wow. Did you ever see? Of course, probably not with that first book. But when did it hit you that what? I think people like this, and this is going to have some legs to it.
I think it took 5 books to make a bestseller. I was also very, very lucky. Not only was I lucky in finding Judy and moving to the States, 2 things I've never regretted, but eventually I found a publisher in London who's still my publisher, and Susan is a very clever woman, and she said, if this is going to work, it's going to take 5 books to make it work, and she turned out to be absolutely right. And I got a 7-book contract off the bat. Now, I don't think that would happen today. I think, that to take a totally unknown writer and to give them a 7-book contract is almost unheard of nowadays. 30, 40 years ago, maybe it was slightly more common. There's an enormous amount of luck involved. There always is.
Yeah. Well, that's very interesting because I think, and what you mentioned earlier, some of these runaway successes like 50 Shades or Game of Thrones, and even Game of Thrones was not an immediate hit. It took a little while to find the audience and then to get this groundswell of love for it. But I think a lot of people just assume that, I'm going to go write this great book and then I'm going to be rich and I'm going to retire and then I'll write 1 book a year. And, there's this myth.
And it happens. It happens.
It does, but it's so rare.
Well, it is rare. But it's like a lot of jobs in the arts. I spend a lot of my time on stage on the stock theatre, and working mostly with very, very young actors who are just at the beginning of their careers. And I love these kids. I absolutely love them. But the truth is that how many of them will ever make it? And very, very few is the answer. Maybe 2 out of 100. It's the same with writing. That there are lots of people who can write, but how many? It's just not fair. There's luck involved. There's
right.
unfairness involved. Life's a bitch. Sorry, not much
Yeah.
we can do about it.
Right. But there is something that does factor into this, and like you said that your lovely wife Judy said that it's going to take 5 books for this to be a success, and so from the outset you had this idea that this was going to be something that you were going to work at and not just expect that.
Yeah,
from
I always say, the other thing I said right at the beginning was that I'm not a sprinter, I'm a marathon runner. By which I mean that some books are an immediate hit, and just woof straight into it. But it's odd how many of those books, you never see a repeat of them. They're a flash in the pan. I always knew from the beginning that I wanted to write a series. And, if you're going to give any advice to somebody who wants to be a commercial writer, write a series. Hook your audience on a character, because they'll go on buying more and more books because they want to read more and more about that character. An enormous number of very commercially successful authors do just that. We can think of dozens and dozens of examples. Hornblow is the obvious one. People love the character of Hornblow. I love Virgil Flowers in John Sandford's books and Lucas Davenport. You read these Dalgleish of P.D. James because you like the character. So I knew that I'd have to, write a series, and I still to this day write a series. I do some one-off books, but mostly they're series.
Good. And an interesting thing happened to Sharp and that series in that the BBC and Sean Bean came into this story somehow. Tell us a little bit about that, how that came to be.
I have no idea. It was actually Granada Television who were a rival of the BBC.
Okay, excuse me.
No, that's fine. God, it all happened so long ago. Most of the books are optioned. In other words, Hollywood or a television company buys the option to make the program, even if they never do make it. Sometimes they buy the option just to stop other people buying the option, which I don't mind. I can remember being told, I can't even remember when, must be back about 1990, that Granada Television wanted to do a series with Sharp. And I thought, well, it'll never happen. It's far too expensive, and but who cares? Cash the check. And then out of the blue, it did happen. I stay away from all this. Right now, what's it called? The Last Kingdom is running on BBC America every Saturday night. And when they started making that, it was the people who made Downton Abbey approached me about that. And they said, do you want to be a technical advisor? I said, no, I don't. I don't want anything to do with it. And there's good reason for that, which is that, I worked in television once, and the one thing I know is that I know nothing about producing television drama. I've never written a TV script. I've never directed actors. I know nothing about it. They know a lot about it.
Right.
So these are among the top drama TV producers in the world. So stay out of their way. Let them do what they do well. And, I think that's the right decision because I love what they've done. I think the series is terrific. So I did the same with Sharp. I just got out of the way. And, when it was finished, I watched it along with everybody else.
Yeah. Were you pleased with the adaptation?
Yeah, absolutely pleased with it. Loved it.
That's wonderful. And I've seen a couple of episodes of the new series that's running on BBC America, and it's excellent. That's wonderful.
I think so too. I love it. They very kindly sent us the DVD, so I got as far as episode 6, and episode 6 is awesome.
Oh, that's wonderful. Perks of being the writer, huh? I think a lot of writers worry about how their work will be translated to film.
Yeah, and I don't think it's worth worrying. It's almost certainly a lot of readers are not going to like what they do. You just have to live with that. I'm getting messages on the website now saying, "Oh, Uhtred has fair hair. Why has Alexander Draymond got dark hair?" And you answer politely, but you don't really want to answer politely. It doesn't matter. Right. It's the quality of the performance. It's the fact that he convinces as Uhtred. And I got the same with Sean Bean as Sharp. People saying, well, Sharp has black hair and Sean doesn't. Well, so what? And so you're never going to please everybody. You really can't please everybody. And I say to people, look, you're getting two for the price of one. You're getting the book, and now you're getting some very clever people, their idea of the book. But you don't, it's just enjoy it. Just sit back, put your feet up, open a beer, and enjoy it.
Right, and you still, as the reader, you still own your idea of the book. Theirs doesn't supersede yours.
Yeah, yes, and frankly, I mean, I found Sean Bean's depiction of sharps so convincing that in many ways he changed my idea of sharp, which I think is great. I think is wonderful. You should be grateful for that. That these very talented, creative, intelligent people have come along and added to what you yourself have done.
That's wonderful. I'd like to shift gears for just a moment and talk about historical fiction. I'm a big historical fiction buff, though I am not very good at writing it. There is a wonderful skill at being able to take these known entities, this very particular period in time, but then to inject new characters or take existing characters and give them life and depth and allow them to have their own story within a pre-made story. Do you have any thoughts about writing historical fiction and how you do that well?
You want me to have thoughts, don't you? I don't know if I have any thoughts. I mean, for a start, I love doing it. And if you don't enjoy doing it, you shouldn't be doing it.
Right.
And how you do it, I don't know. I think the Somerset Maugham said there are 3 rules about writing a novel. Unfortunately, nobody knows what they are. I mean, you can sort of get very pedantic and say that almost all historical fiction contains 2 stories. There's a big story. The big story is, can the South win the Civil War? The little story is, can Scarlett save Tara? And the trick of it is to flip them. So you put the little story in the foreground, and the big story goes into the background. I mean that basically is what we do. I don't know. I never actually think about it very much. I mean, I've just started a new book. For me, every book is an adventure in the sense that I don't know what's going to happen in it, and I want to be surprised, because the joy of reading a book is to find out what happens. Well, oddly enough, the joy of writing a book is to find out what happens too. And I mean, I'm finding it extraordinary that as I'm, I think the 10th book of the Uhtred, the Saxon stories. I mean, already in chapter 3 is going places I never expected it to go. And I said to Judy this morning, God, the poor bugger's in real trouble this time, and I don't know how to get him out. Well, I've got the next 4, 5, 6 months to find out how he gets out. So I just don't know. I mean, if you enjoy writing it is the answer. You sit down there and you have a good time. You're being paid to make up stories, to hear voices in your head, to see things that people haven't seen for 1,000 years. It's great.
My writer friend Chris Porteau and I were talking this week. We're both great admirers of your work, and I told him that I was interviewing you, and we were just talking about different things that we should talk about. And Chris wanted to know, what do you do? At what point, when you're writing historical fiction and you're writing these characters, at what point does character give way to history, or does history give way to your character? In other words, when you're writing
almost always history gives way.
Okay.
I mean, I'm not an historian. I'm a storyteller. So the story must take precedence over the history. Well, of course, you can't sort of twist it. You can't, suddenly give Robert E. Lee an AK-47. I mean, at that point, you've left the grounds altogether, and I don't know what you're doing.
Right.
But it's I talked about the big story and the little story. The big story is going to be there in the background. The little story is going to be in the foreground. The little story is almost entirely fiction. It will have a few real characters in it, like Sharp meets Wellington and so on. And in Uhtred meets Alfred the Great. So you have these real people. But essentially you're telling a story. The reason people are going to buy your book, they're not buying your book to find out about history. They're buying your book because you tell a story, and because we love stories, and because they want to know what happened. And I always say to people, you want to know about the Peninsular War? There is a wonderful book by a man called Charles Esdale, Professor Esdale. It's called The Peninsular War. It'll tell you everything you need to know. But I'll make you a promise. When you get to the end of chapter 2 or 4 or 6 or 8, it's not going to keep you awake at night. You're not going to say, oh, gosh, I've got to find out what happens. That's not a criticism, right? It's a brilliant, wonderful book. But if you read my book, I hope I keep you awake. Why? Because you want to know what happens. And so you're a storyteller above everything. But of course, if you're an historical novelist, you've got to keep the small story within the constraints of the larger one. And I mean, that's actually not difficult to do, because the large story has probably given you the idea for the small story. And it's just, it's what you do. But in the end, I remember, I get swamped by people sending me books saying, will I do a puff for them, a quote that will go on the cover.
Sure.
And I got one, 6 months ago. And it was set in ancient Rome. And on page 1, you have this slave walking through Rome, and she looks up at the Colosseum, and she says to herself, oh, there is the Colosseum. It was built by Emperor whatever. And 100 years later, it was rebuilt by Emperor whatever. And I just closed the book. Because all you're doing is reading her boring research.
Right.
Who cares? You can Google that. You can find out for yourself.
Yeah.
And anyway, if you're walking through ancient Rome in whatever year it was, you don't think that. You think something quite different. So she didn't, this slave didn't convince me that she was real. You don't fill it up with history. History is a background. It's a wonderful, rich background. But leave your research out. I think I throw away 95% of my research.
Well, and the research has to take form in character. That's just having
it gives the story its reality. I mean, even in Game of Thrones, that's what George does. George weaves this amazing fantasy, which is wonderful, entertaining fantasy. But in the background there's a solid body of research about medieval warfare habits and manners and so on. But George has the sense to keep it light.
Right.
Which we all must do. You've got to keep it light.
Right. One thing I'm interested to know is you're an Englishman, obviously, who now lives in America.
I'm an American.
Excuse me. But by birth, you're an Englishman.
Right.
Now an American, but you primarily write about England and the Middle Ages and the Dark Ages. How does living in America shape your view of these stories that you write? And the longer
I don't know if it does.
Okay.
I mean, maybe it does. I mean, somebody else could probably answer that question better. But if you think that, C.S. Forrester wrote the Hornblower books, Living in California. P.G. Woodhouse wrote the most quintessential English books, Jeeves and Wooster, right? Living in Long Island. There's a pretty long tradition of writers coming to America and then writing about Britain. I mean, I guess I write about Britain because I understand Britain much better than I understand America. I grew up there. I hear British voices in my head. I know the landscape. I know the history. And I feel much more comfortable, I think, writing in a British milieu than I do in American one. And you write to a large extent. You write what you know. And I've always loved history. I loved history since a child. And you start by learning the history of your own country. And Britain, of course, has got an awful lot of it. I'm pretty comfortable writing about America now, but even after living half my life here, and it is half my life, and more than half of my adult life, I still, in a sense, probably feel more comfortable in a British environment. I don't mean for living and life, because I will never leave America, just in the sense of the history. Feel more comfortable with British history. And I do hear British voices in my head, in the sense that I hear the intonations, the slang, and so on. What I'm hearing is the voices I knew as I grew up.
Well, and Britain has a deeper well of history to draw from than America's a still a very young country.
You say that. I mean, I'm always astonished at how much. I mean, I split my time between Cape Cod, in a town that was sort of settled in the 1630s, and Charleston, South Carolina. And honestly, there's a lot of history in both places, an enormous amount of history, and fascinating history, and wonderful history.
Yeah.
You think the United States of America is older than Italy or Germany, than most of the countries you think of as being very ancient. So anyway, never mind. But yes, I mean, of course, the well of British history is deeper. And although, I think you're deepening the American well pretty well. So
yeah. Well, and there's also this there's this legendary history in Britain, and you've even delved into it in your Arthur books. What brought you to tackle that subject?
Well, I think the story of King Arthur, of course, it's at the taproot of British history. It is right way back there. But whenever you think about what does it mean to be British, what does it mean to be English, you in the end you're going to end up with Arthur. And of course we've messed it up totally, because Arthur almost certainly was probably what we would now call Welsh, and was he's one of the biggest enemies the English ever had. But the English rather cleverly have co-opted him onto their side. And the other thing about Arthur, of course, is that it's a body of legends that is endlessly malleable. I mean, Arthur is all things to all people, and certainly at different periods. So, I mean, the very, very, very first stories of Arthur, which we know, are mostly told by early Celtic saints. And he's a villain. He's a murderer, a rapist, and a thief. Somehow, he's transmuted from being Jack Nicholson into being Sean Connery. He suddenly becomes a good guy.
Right.
Then over the years, he's transformed. Tennyson made him into a muscular Christian hero. There's all sorts of different Arthurs, and in a sense, he lends himself to these translations or to these interpretations. And my own theory is that what he represents is a lost golden age, and that as the Saxons, that's us, invaded Britain, and then they drove the Britons themselves out of their land, or the Welsh word for England is Slugir, which means the lost lands. That the one man who resisted the Saxons was, in fact, Arthur, probably the man who won the Battle of Mountbatten. And for a generation, Gildas tells us, Gildas was writing back then, he says, for a generation, the Saxons were held at bay. They actually paid tribute to the Britons. So for a generation, you could plant your seed and know that you could live to see the harvest. You could have children and be pretty confident they weren't going to be captured and sold into slavery. And that was all because of Arthur. And then it all went horrible again, and then the Saxons finished their conquest. But people look back on Arthur as the man who'd given them hope and who'd given them this generation of peace and victory. So for me, Arthur represents a golden age.
Yeah. Now you can't have Arthur without Merlin. So what is your?
Yes, I mean, in fact, Arthur went without Merlin for hundreds of years. In the early stories, there's no Merlin. Merlin everything gets wrapped up into the Arthur stories. I mean, it was a Frenchman who introduced the idea of adultery. I mean, it does take a Frenchman to put adultery into a good British story.
I was going to ask you about the French connection to the Arthur story, but go ahead.
Until Chrétien de Troyes came along, Chrétien de Troyes added Camelot and he added Lancelot. So all these things are accreted to the story. The story will just keep like a snowball, rolls along, gets bigger and bigger and bigger. There is a series, I won't name it, where she has written the stories of Arthur, but only keeping in the original characters from the sort of 8th, 9th, 10th centuries. And I actually thought of doing that with a trilogy I wrote on him, and then realized that if you have Arthur without Merlin, it doesn't work, and you've got to put it in. And yes, there's magic involved, and in other words, the story has been embellished, and it's grown wings, and it's become wonderful. But we probably never know what the real Arthur was like, because he's now become a symbol. He's just become a symbol, they say, of a lost world. on a golden world, which we call Camelot.
How do you handle Merlin's magic by setting this in a realistic setting?
Well, I tried to make the magic realistic. I mean, I was delighted to discover, and I discovered it, as we all do, through reading Pliny the Younger, that there's a shellfish called a piddock, and you can find piddocks in Britain. And if you sort of winkle a piddock out of wherever piddocks shelter, and I can't remember now exactly how you do it, but you basically take the juice of a piddock and you rub it on yourself, and your skin will glow in the dark. And this is true. I mean, it works. I mean, as they say, don't try this at home. Actually, I don't see why you shouldn't. If you can find a piddock, do try it at home.
Right.
So, there's a scene in the book where Merlin suddenly has these people who are glowing in the dark. Well, of course, it's magic, isn't it? I mean, we know, this can't happen. It has to be magic. So I tried very hard to make the magic explicable. In other words, there's always some trick that he knows and we don't know, and we think it's magic, but he knows it isn't magic. But the lovely thing that happened as I sort of wrote those 3 books is eventually his magic rather lost touch with reality, and it began to get more and more magic. And I thought, okay, I'm just going to let that happen because it's fun.
In the early 90s, you also wrote a series of thrillers set in modern times. Was that a shift of gears for you to leave?
Well, back in those days, I was writing 2 books a year, and I just thought I'll try it. The historical novels were doing very nicely, thank you, and I thought it would be fun to try something else just to see whether you enjoy it. So I did, and then decided I didn't, so I stopped.
And do you have any desire to go back to
no,
those settings?
none at all. No. I mean, I tried that, and it was fun for a time. And I mean, it was literally, if you like, it was a luxury. It was a luxury that I could afford to do because the historical novels were selling. And I thought, let's find out how easy is it to write a modern thriller? And I found it was far more difficult than writing an historical novel.
Wow.
And I'm not saying I didn't enjoy it, because I did enjoy it. But I enjoyed writing historical novels more, so I stopped doing that.
Right. As a writer who is very prolific and who has a great body of work that you've amassed, and who is still very actively writing and adding to that body of work, what is your daily writing process like?
It's very, very dull. I mean, this is going to be a really boring answer, but you asked the question, so you deserve it. I get up early in the morning and I start work. I take the dog for a walk, I go back to work. I take the dog for another walk, I go back to work. And about 6 o'clock at night, I go down and pour a whiskey. There you go. Day after day after day, every day. There's no possible excuse for not working. I don't believe there is such a thing as writer's block. The day that a nurse can phone her hospital and say, I can't come into work today because I've got nurse's block. And the hospital goes, no, you mustn't. No, God, that's terrible. Stay away. We feel sorry for you. Of course, we'll go on paying you, but don't come to work. I mean, it sounds nonsensical because it is nonsensical. And being a nurse is a far more difficult job than being a writer. And as far as I know, all of us who write volunteered. We said, this is what we want to do. So you don't then start bitching and saying, I can't do it, it's too hard. That writer's block is nature's way of telling you you're not a writer. Now, there are exceptions to this rule. And the obvious exception is someone who is just beginning, someone who's launching their career, trying their first book or their second book. Because when you're doing that, you are beset by this horrible doubt that nobody will ever read the book, that the book is no good, that you're wasting your time. And those doubts, which are enormous and totally natural, will sap the confidence, and there are going to be days where you think, I just can't even do this because I know I'm not doing it well enough. And that is a form of writer's block, which I think is utterly forgivable. And people who suffer from that have to remember that every single writer, every single one, from the greatest to the least who is published, began exactly the same way, having exactly those same doubts. So that is something you simply have to work your way through. And there are ways of doing that. So, yes, that's a form of writer's block, which I think is forgivable. And possibly, too, if you're a genius. If you're writing works of wonderful literature that will be read 300 or 400 years from now, then maybe you can be assailed by doubts, but I wouldn't know about that. So, but the rest of us who are professional writers, every day you sit down and you write.
Well, I think there are two main weapons against writer's block, and one is consistency, like you said, and the other is preparation.
You have bad days, You have really bad days where nothing goes right, and so that's not writer's block. I notice that the stories when I'm writing, they slow down enormously when my subconscious isn't quite sure where the story is going. And there are days, last week I wrote probably 20,000 words, which after I thought, no, it's going in the wrong direction, so you throw them away. But at least those bad days tell you something. They tell you, okay, the story doesn't go north, it goes south. But that's not writer's block. That's, you're just sitting down and writing. Even if it's a bad day, that bad day is going to tell you something about the book you're writing.
When you throw away those 20,000 words, do you save those in another file that, hey, maybe I can use this in another...
Sometimes, but rarely. I did save those. In fact, they probably will go back into Chapter 3 now you mentioned it. Now you've got me thinking about it.
You're welcome.
But they'll have to be rewritten rather drastically.
Right. When you begin a book, do you have an outline that you work from, or do you have a...
Not. I have no idea whatsoever. I was writing the last book in the series, which was called, can I remember? Yes, Warriors of the Storm. I promise you, I got to the last chapter, and I still didn't know how it was going to end.
Wow.
And I love that. That's what I absolutely love about writing, is you write to find out what happens. Right at this moment, Uhtred is in real trouble, and we're only in Chapter 3. And I don't know how to get him out of it yet. But we'll find a way, when we finish this interview, I shall go back up there and I shall see what he does. I can't do outlines. I never could. A friend of mine once said to me that every book is like a journey which has never been taken before. So how can you draw a map of that journey, because you've never done it? And I'm with him on that. I think it was the great E.L. Doctorow who said that writing a novel is rather like driving a car down an unfamiliar country road at night, and you can only see as far ahead as the rather dim headlamps allow you to see. Now, that said, there are other writers, obviously Joanna Rowling, Patrick Robinson, C.S. Forrester, who outline everything.
Right.
And that's great, because they can do that. If you can do that, it's wonderful. I can't. Right way back at the beginning, when the publisher was saying, send me a synopsis. And I said, well, I have to write the book to find out what the synopsis is.
Do you have any tips or hints for being what we colloquially call a pantser, someone who writes by the seat of their pants as opposed to outlining, and also being very prolific in getting through the work? I think a lot of people that don't outline have the trouble that they just kind of linger because they don't know where the story is going. So how do you keep the sense of urgency to keep pushing forward with the story, even though you don't have a map that you're working from?
It's your job. It's your journey. Keep moving. And
I love it.
As I said, there are no rules. There are 3 rules, and no one knows what they are. And the answer is I don't know, except that if what you're writing begins to bore you, then you're in trouble. P.G. Wodehouse, when he wrote his books, he used to, back in the sort of glorious days when we all used typewriters, as each page was finished, he would take the page and he would thumbtack it to the wall. Now, if he was really pleased with it and thought, yeah, that's good, that page is good, it went high up on the wall. If he thought, I haven't got that page right, it went down the bottom of the wall. If he wasn't quite sure, it went somewhere in the middle. So you have this sort of patchwork of pages, some high, some low, some in between. And then he could immediately look at them and say, okay, these are the pages that need rewriting. And that was his way of doing it. If there's an instinct you have, I think, if you're a writer. The instinct tells you, this is getting dull. Move it on.
Bernard Cornwell, you've been very gracious with your time today. Thank you for coming on the show.
Thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure.
The new TV show is called The Last Kingdom. It's on BBC America, and it's fantastic. Everyone should look it up. If you could give one piece of advice to a writer that's maybe struggling with the craft, or is maybe from your long career looking back, what piece of advice would you give to a writer who just needs some encouragement and some motivation?
Just enjoy what you're doing. If you're not enjoying doing it, then you're doing the wrong thing. It really is. You go back to the fact that we start by writing for ourselves. We write for our own amusement. You write the book you want to read. So do that. Sit there and enjoy it. Because if you enjoy it, the reader might well enjoy it. But if you don't enjoy writing it, I can promise you the reader won't enjoy reading it either. Yeah.
They can spot a fake.
Advice, is it?
Yeah. No, that's great. I think a lot of writers put too much pressure sometimes, and you're absolutely right. If you don't enjoy it, it's not going to be an enjoyable book. The reader can spot a fake.
And stop worrying about that first draft. I mean, I think that's one of the things that certainly for beginner writers is they think, oh God, the style is lousy. This is not coming. It's horrible. For me, the first draft is only about finding the story, nothing else. The grammar doesn't matter. The style doesn't matter. Just find the story. Get those characters, wind them up, set them off, see what they do. And then the fun begins when you rewrite, which, thank goodness, computers have made so easy. I can remember when rewriting used to be, you had to do the whole thing, page after page on a typewriter. Nowadays, it's easy. But it's the rewriting where you put in the trim, where you varnish it, where you have the fun, where you add to the dialogue. And it's amazing what you can do to a story if you finish it with the first draft. It doesn't matter how bad that first draft is. I mean, I've taken out a villain and put in a whole new villain in a book. I mean, it took about 3 days because the basic story is there. So stop worrying. You're not going to produce the finished article first time out. In the first draft, you're not going to have a book that is publishable. What you should have at the end of the first draft is a story that is compelling. Now you go back and have fun with it.
In the editing phase, have you ever gone back and read a section and got excited that the story did it strike you like, oh wow, I wrote this? That's
I never reread them. They're all up on the shelf. I leave them there. The best book is always the next one.
Right. What is your latest book that people can go find? And
there are two. There's early this year we published Waterloo, which is my only non-fiction book, which is obviously a story of the Battle of Waterloo. It's his 200th anniversary this year, and then I think the last novel I published, I ought to know, I think it's The Pagan Lord. And in January, the new Uhtred book, part of the Last Kingdom series, is called Warriors of the Storm. That's just been published in Britain, and will be coming out here in, I think, January.
Excellent. Mr. Cornwell, thank you again for coming on the show. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Hank. Thank you.
Thanks for listening to the Author Stories podcast. For more great author interviews like this one, go to hankgarner.com and dig through the archives. There's something there I know you'll love. Now stay tuned for a special audio clip from Richard Gleaves' The Jason Crane series.
What in the name of Carl Sagan was he doing in the cemetery on Halloween? What was he thinking? He whirled, expecting the Headless Horseman himself to be waiting on the road ahead. Or was he lurking behind? He wanted to run, but now the bridge ahead worried him. Doesn't the horseman haunt bridges? Could he avoid crossing it somehow? It terrified him. Why? It was just a stupid bridge. The gloom beneath could have been the lair of a troll. Billy Goat's Gruff. Mama used to read that. The troll waits beneath for the fattest, sweetest goat. Jason thought he saw something on the far end of the bridge, a shape of some sort. He stepped onto the bridge and gripped the knotty railing. He felt the ground drop away beneath as he edged forward. His eyes remained on the shape. It's nothing. It's nothing. Is it nothing? No troll attacked him as he reached the other shore. The looming shape was only a stupid stairwell opposite the bridge that climbed up the hill and into the main cemetery. He turned left and ran, admitting defeat and letting the fear take him over. He ran southward down the long, dark road. His initial burst of adrenaline ran its course, and he slowed, then walked again, limping a little. Headstones slipped past on the right. He still had enough light that he caught his reflection occasionally in the polished stone. He looked very young and very thin. He could feel his vulnerability as he walked along. He grew aware of his own body, the touch of his starchy dress shirt and his jacket and the soft weight of his backpack. He saw himself reflected in the headstones, just a container of warm fluids, flimsy work for a blade or a hoof or a sword. He felt shatterable and transient, and his next breath was not guaranteed, oh no. The leaves made a faint oceanic rustle all around. The insects sang their three-note songs. Jason Crane, Jason Crane, Jason Crane. Jason sang a wretched pop song as he walked, something about having no self-control and no bitches and not enough money. He sang it softly, absent-mindedly, as if reciting a psalm. He passed Reese, Finnerton, Bain, Ekdal, Forest, Black, Small. There. He saw the gate at the end of the road. But the gate would be locked, he remembered. He would have to climb the embankment and cross over the churchyard. He could see the spire of the church above and the weather vane spinning against the sky. He would rather climb this gate than face that churchyard, but the spikes on top made leaping the fence impossible. Okay, just be quick. Something caught his ear, a brittle, clipping sound. He scanned the crest above and saw a horse silhouetted among the graves. It looked to be tied to a branch of the locust tree. He had heard its hooves as it shifted from foot to foot. It rustled somehow. His breath caught. He forced himself to be calm and rational. Some Halloween thing, maybe, for some event. He found the stairs and ascended, sideways, ready to bolt if necessary. He watched the horse, but when he neared the top he saw the rider, standing upon the shallow depression of the horseman's grave. The figure was motionless, a dim shape that absorbed light and gave nothing back. He could make out the shape of the boots and the legs and two arms held away from the body, palms down. Just a man? But the cape of the thing was not normal. It contorted painfully, twisting in the air even though the wind wasn't blowing. It wrung itself and billowed and whipped slowly, as if the figure wore a wave torn from a black ocean. And above its shoulders, is he headless? Is he headless?